Good afternoon from Singapore, and hello and welcome to the Asia panel of this year's FES Tiergarten Conference. We apologize for the slight delay. We had a few technical issues to fix, but here we are and happy to join you for our Asia panel. My name is Mirco Günther, and I am the director of the FES Office for Regional Cooperation in Asia. Our Tiergarten Conference, as you know, is the annual FES Forum for Foreign Policy and Security Affairs. And we are excited to welcome a very international audience from Europe, from Asia, and indeed globally today. I have a few technical announcements to make before we start, and I would ask our support team to quickly pull up the slide for our rules of procedure. Can we have that next slide, please, for the rules of procedure? If not, then I can just summarize our rules of procedure orally. Our discussion, as you know, is being live streamed. Here we go. Our discussion is being live streamed at the FES website. Registered participants are invited to use the chat function. With a username you can select yourself. And we are, of course, strongly encouraging everyone to make active use of it so we have a lively debate. Our interpretation today is available in English and in German. We are recording this session for documentation purposes only, and similar to other FES events, we have a code of conduct and would ask you to only comment on issues related to the topic of our panel. Thank you for the slide. Now, let's get started with our session then. In terms of the theme for today's session, I believe that most observers would agree that multilateralism and cooperative security are facing unprecedented challenges. And in many ways, yesterday's opening panel that put the spotlight on Europe had very similar observations in that regard. Nowhere is the crisis of multilateralism more obvious, though, than in Asia. We are all witnessing how the escalating tensions between the United States and China have ripple effects for the entire region, and how the COVID-19 crisis adds additional geopolitical dynamics which are likely to lead to a new strategic normal in Asia. And just to underline or speaking to the importance of our region, the German Foreign Office has just recently published a new strategic document and guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, with German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas stating that it is indeed the Indo-Pacific where the shape of the international rules-based order of tomorrow will be decided. So lots of issues to talk about, and to help us look at those issues, we have a fantastic panel of eminent experts with us today. I'm very glad to welcome Professor Raja Mohan here in Singapore, Professor Mely Caballero-Anthony, who's also joining us here from Singapore, and Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak, who is joining us from Bangkok. The order in which we will proceed is that we first hear from Raja Mohan, followed by Professor Anthony and Professor Pongsudhirak. Now, Raja Mohan obviously needs little introduction. He is the director of the Institute of South Asia Studies at the National University here in Singapore, and he is a leading expert and preeminent scholar on India and on South Asia. And I'm also glad to say that Raja Mohan is a long-standing partner of FES Asia. And while it would be taking too much time to list all his professional positions that he has held, one thing that our viewers might not know about Raja Mohan is that he holds indeed a master's degree in nuclear physics, which, if you think about it, might be a very useful skill or discipline to help us untangle the complex web of issues that we are looking into today and to make sense of the unfolding new normal in Asia. So Raja, we are very glad to have you back, and we are looking forward to hearing how you assess the state and future of cooperative security, particularly in South Asia, and how India's foreign and security policy are changing, in fact, in light of the intensifying great power competition in the Indo-Pacific and in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. A very warm welcome again, Raja, and the floor is yours for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mirco. Thank you for inviting me for this Tiergarten Conference. Delighted to be part of this panel with such distinguished colleagues. What I thought I'll do is really to look at the trends in South Asia and see how they relate to the larger region. So I'll frame my presentation in three themes. The first is about I just want to say a word about the structure of South Asian security. which has always been geopolitical and less multilateral. So for the new normal, as far as South Asia is concerned, is the fact that geopolitics tended to trump multilateralism and regionalism within the region. And that today, what has changed is really the cast of characters has changed fundamentally. Because it's important to remember that South Asia was really a single coherent space till 1947. It was the British Raj, it was the one very much part of the imperial defense system, and it was the center of the security and other structures that emerged in the 19th and the early, up to the middle of the 20th century. But the partition of the subcontinent broke up this centrality of India. India's own socialist economics pulled it away from the rest of the region. But the division of the subcontinent meant the internal conflicts overtook. And its intersection with the external politics saw the West, initially Britain, then the United States, as the principal external force shaping the regional balance. And then while China was next door, once it came in control of Tibet, so Russia, US became the external factors shaping the regional balance. Now, it's end of the Cold War, of course, saw some change in the region, where the region was engaged with Asian regional institutions, and it was attempted at promoting internal South Asian regionalism as well. But unfortunately, neither of them has gone too far. And I think what we're going to see is actually a sharper intersection of South Asian conflicts with the rest of them, especially with the rise of China as the principal new external factor that is changing the landscape of South Asia. And the US-China conflict adds another wrinkle to this dynamic in South Asia. So the role of China, as I said, that brings me to the second point. The rise of China as the second largest economy in the world and as a large neighbor of the subcontinent meant today South Asia faces the full force of the radiating Chinese power in the subcontinent, whether it is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the China-Burma economic corridor, Chinese roads across Tibet. So what you've seen is actually the inflow of the Chinese ingress, the integration of South Asia increasingly with China, but a sharpening of the conflict between India and China at various levels. The attempted normalization of the relationship between India and China over the last many years really did not work, and we had 30 years of relative peace. But the rise of China and its determination, I think from my perspective, trying to redeem its territorial claims on the India-China border has actually made it, we've seen a series of military crises, 2013, 2014, 2017, and now we're in the middle of a eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between the two forces. So the boundary, which lay dormant for the last many decades, is now a live one, and a full-fledged conflict is unfolding. On the economic front, the huge digital apps of the Chinese points to a new determination in India that that the costs of full integration with China are serious, and it's willing to pay the price if needed be. But decoupling has become an important part of India's current policy, and it is deeply tied to the what's happening on the boundary side. India was also the first country to oppose the Belt and Road Initiative, pointing to its geopolitical consequences in South Asia, as well as a debt trap some of India's neighbors were getting into. But that brings me to the third point. Probably the most important consequence of the US-China conflict is the India-US rapprochement. In fact, you see today the emergence of an Indian pivot to the United States. You could say India traditionally non-aligned, sometimes neutral, and which has carefully hedged between major powers today. The greater the pressure from China on its frontiers, the greater the Chinese penetration of India's neighborhood, India is now looking at a much stronger security partnership with the United States. This does not mean India is going to be a Japan to the United States, or a Britain to the United States, or become a part of a NATO-like structure, but it will be on terms that India negotiates bilaterally with the United States, of dealing with a fundamental change in India's and Asia's security environment. So this, whether it is through the quadrilateral mechanism, whether it is through the joint support for the Indo-Pacific idea, that you're seeing today an extraordinary convergence of Indian and US positions on regional security issues. This is really something fundamentally different from what India has done for the last 70 years, because people had assumed that being anti-West, anti-American was part of Indian DNA, but we are now seeing something fundamentally different. So I think this is a consequence of the changed circumstance triggered by China's rise and its assertion. That brings me to the set of conclusions on multilateralism, since your whole conference is on multilateralism. Strangely, India had a multilateral idea when it became independent. It was deeply Asianist. It talked about Asian unity, Asian solidarity. It talked about the United Nations, a liberal international system. But its anti-colonial, anti-imperial framework put it at odds with the West and made India's ability to succeed with its internationalism and multilateralism problematic, and it didn't really succeed. Today, I think India's coming back to internationalism, multilateralism in a very strange new ways, which I think is going to be interesting and which is worth watching. India today, for the first time, joined the German initiative on, what is it called? Alliance for Multilateralism. At the UN, at the UNGA, India was part of it. It is today talking to the Americans on a Quad Plus structure for resilience in supply chains in the wake of the pandemic. It's recently held a conference with Japan and Australia on resilient supply chains within Asia. So for the first time, you're seeing actually India becoming willing to be part of a new framework of multilateral coalitions. This is certainly new for India. India was either for WTO or was it for unilateral action? But today, it is beginning to move towards a coalition approach of like-minded states, which I think is going to be fundamentally different and significant. And I think that's what we need to see. India welcomed, unlike Germany, India welcomed Trump's invitation to be part of a G10 or G11 meeting in Washington. We don't know whether it will take place, but the fact is, India is open today to become part of a democracy coalition beyond, I'm talking the Quad at a global level, whether it is an American initiative for a G10 or a British initiative for a D10, whether it is collaboration on the technology field. India is, even as its geopolitical situation worsens, it's open to new forms of multilateralism. So that brings me to my final thought. I think Europeans tend to separate as if multilateralism and geopolitics are two different worlds. In my view, it was never separate. That the extraordinary multilateral success of the 1990s was the consequence of end of geopolitical rivalry. And once that phase ended, when you saw Russia assert itself, the rise of China seeking its own interests, that the multilateral structures will change. So those who dream to simply go back, let's go back to WTO as it is. Because China's entry into the WTO has fundamentally changed the structure of the trading relations. So I think there is going to be some change. The gaming of the international system by China is going to force a readaptation. So merely saying, let's go back to WTO is not going to work. Similarly, the question of security structures, that let's everybody get together, that situation is not going to work. And my sense is that you need to see coalitions. And I think the redistribution of power at the global system would demand a new set of coalitions. And India, for the first time, is willing to be a part of those coalitions led by the West. And India is open today to do more with the European powers in the Indo-Pacific, whether it is France, whether it's Britain, and most recently Germany. So India is quite open to seeing what Germany is willing to do in the Indo-Pacific and work with it. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raja, for your comprehensive and thought-provoking pitch. I note in particular the 3 points that you have made with regard to, as you put it, geopolitics trumping multilateralism, the rise of China, and India's pivot to the United States. And we have also taken note of your point with regard to India's new willingness and openness to join new forms of multilateralism. So truly worthwhile points indeed, and I'm sure that there will be a helpful foundation for our discussion, and I'm certain we will get back to your points a little later. Let's move on then to our second distinguished speaker. I have the pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Mely Caballero-Anthony, who is a professor of international relations and head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the Raja Mohan School of International Studies at Nanyang Technical University here in Singapore. Professor Anthony, among many other assignments, served as member and chairperson of the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, and she was also a co-chair of our global FES reflection group on the monopoly on the use of force. Raja and Mely in particular have published extensively on regionalism and multilateralism in Asia, and Mely can surely help us look at one of our region's major organizations, the Southeast Asian Nations Association, ASEAN, its current state and future, particularly in light of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis and the larger regional and national dynamics at play. So without further ado, it's very good to have you back, Mely, and the floor is yours for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mirco, and I'm really, really delighted to join this panel organized by FES. Fun memories of the time when we worked together on the project on the monopoly on the use of force. I've been asked to talk about the state of ASEAN cooperation, or ASEAN in the midst of this COVID-19. And yes, I have 3 points, really. And the first one is that the current situation with this combination of a extraordinary, once in a lifetime, once in a century rather, pandemic, combined with an extraordinary economic crisis that's, you know, I think it's, people would say it's the worst since the global recession in the 1930s, has again iterated the importance of, one, multilateralism, that's one, but second really is the importance of regional multilateralism. In the context of ASEAN, this is not, by the way, the first health crisis. As we know, they have experienced SARS in 2003 and H1N1. But what has happened is it has only underscored really the notion of your security is my security. So within the notion of the ASEAN political security, which basically underscores the raising of political and security cooperation to a higher plane, this crisis therefore has more than ever reinforced that notion. And for what it's worth, and despite its limitations as an intergovernmental organization, of course not as big as that of Europe and not as materially resourced, but if you look at it in the key areas where ASEAN is focusing its work really on deepening and enhancing cooperation in the health sector. I've been following the crisis since the time it broke out in early January, and you could see that whatever investments ASEAN has put with regard to enhancing cooperation in the health sector are in a way bearing some fruit, because from the very beginning, in January, the mechanisms that ASEAN had established, you know, in 2003, they were unprepared. But in 2020, you could see that the mechanisms for pandemic preparedness and response were really mobilized. One of that is the Emergency Operating Center that basically became the nerve center for circulating much needed information. The information sharing is very critical because it gives you an idea of the state of the rate of infection across the region. You now have virtual information center that's being managed by the secretary that looks at risk assessment. And of course, you have the exchange, more importantly, in public health laboratory network, the expertise and the epidemiological training. All that was basically put in place. And now moving forward, we are, in 2003 and 2005 to 2009, there was a lot of idea of pushing for an ASEAN Centers for Disease Control. I think now that that is already being seriously considered. They call it the ASEAN Public Health Emergency Center, and there's a lot of interest, even from the US, to, ironically, to actually build that capacity in the region. There's also now, as a result of this pandemic, travel has been so badly affected. So they are now at the stage of really looking at protocols, travel protocols and health protocols, because the idea that you have at least some kind of standardized protocols, it's in the works, would really help the region, whose economic security has really suffered tremendously. Most of the economic analysis at the moment really talked about basically wiping out much of the economic gains over the last 20 years. The projections are quite frightening, with -1% to -4% in the context of Southeast Asia. And when you're talking about how it impacts on the real economy, when you're really looking at the number, just the figures when it comes to unemployment, you're looking at additional maybe another 1.1 million. So that's the first point, that you're really you're better able to appreciate the fact that security cooperation, particularly in this area, is very important. Now, second is, the whole notion of ASEAN pushing. Of course, the geopolitics is there. The concerns about nuclear proliferation, maritime security are really, really very important in light of the ongoing competition, as Raj just mentioned, between the US and China. But there's also been ASEAN's contribution to the security debate, and that is basically the importance of comprehensive and cooperative security. And in the context of comprehensive security, non-traditional security issues like pandemics, for example, and economic security have now really come to surface in the most compelling way. So, but ASEAN can only be successful because it is, at the end of the day, the sum of its parts. So the second really is, while you have all this cooperation at the regional level, there is, of course, the importance of implementation. And this is where national politics really matter. When it comes to, for example, coming up with travel protocols or agreeing on the health protocols. I mean, it's, in spite of all these talks that's going on, there is that balancing act between the regional interests and the national interests. And this, I think, is the most challenging aspects on the part of ASEAN. So there's the national component that really has to be considered. But if you look at it in the context of how they're trying to work around it, the 10 member states, at least in the area of economic cooperation, a number of statements has come up. But I think if you look at the current work among the economic and trade ministers, the fact that they really want to ensure that the supply chains remain uninterrupted and that supply chains are resilient. The only way to do that is to ensure that the possible non-tariff measures are actually reduced. I'm not in a position to really gauge where that is, but there is, I think, appreciation, particularly when you apply that in very important or essential medical goods. That is very critical. And it's not just economic security that you're worried about, within, as a result of the crisis, with all of this lockdown, there is a very critical issue about food security in the region. So supply chain, having that uninterrupted is increasingly, is in fact very, very critical. So in that respect, again, when you look at the investments that ASEAN has done in building mechanisms as far as food security is concerned, in working with other partners, its dialogue partners, China, Japan, and South Korea, in having a rice emergency reserve, for example, or just ensuring that they are, you're able to address some of the, some of deficits that you have when it comes to major staples. These are, of course, very, very important. And third point, I guess, is that while we talk about, a return, or if you like, a return of your investments on mechanisms, but at the same time being careful and having need to balance national interests, which will always be there. The third really is that, as a regional organization, ASEAN, I think, has shown, the extent to which you can actually bring countries together. But more importantly, and this is something that I think we can pick up later on, that the need for regional organizations to really raise and increase their voice in very critical issues. Dr. Thitinan will talk about, the politics of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis other partners, particularly China. But my point is the need to raise critical voices when it comes to improving global health governance. And what do I mean by that? One of the main agenda now around the world is really getting equitable access to vaccines, right? So many countries at the moment are looking at possibilities, ensuring that they have their supplies of exclusive supply of the vaccine. And this is something that really worries developing countries like ASEAN. And there's this thing about vaccine nationalism versus vaccine nationalism, multilateralism. And this is where regional organizations matter. And this is where multilateral frameworks are important in giving a voice to the needs of those that really are seriously affected as a result of this double crisis, the economic and the health crisis. So is multilateralism very important? Yes. Organizations like ASEAN, and ASEAN that has been in a way leading the multilateralism, the thrust to multilateralism in the region, I think needs to work harder and ensuring that it is credible, and it is by dealing with many of the issues that it faces now and ensuring that they are able to implement many of the programs that they have set in place in response to the crisis will in a way reinforce that the notion that multilateralism indeed matters. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mely. Indeed, lots of good food for thought for our debate. And I'm glad that you presented a somewhat more optimistic outlook, at least in terms of the importance of continued multilateral engagement and strong regional institutions, but also a very candid assessment, I would say, of the many challenges and potential pitfalls that lie ahead. A quick note, an announcement for our audience and viewership. After the technical problems at the beginning, and we apologize again for the rough start, our chat functionality below the mainstream, or the live stream rather, is now working properly. And we would invite you all to please log in and to share your questions and comments in order to have a lively and open debate. So please do log in and join the discussion. Moving on to our third speaker then, and final speaker, we are very fortunate to have Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak with us today, who is joining us from Bangkok. He is a leading expert on Thailand, Southeast Asia and international security affairs, a professor at the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, and the director of the Institute of Security and International Studies. We've been very lucky to work with Professor Thitinan and to benefit from Professor Thitinan's insights in our FES Asia Corona brief recently. And we look forward to hearing from you, Thitinan, more actually on the geopolitical aspects of the current situation in terms of how the pandemic is shaping geopolitical developments in Southeast Asia and how the great power competition between the United States and China are shaping national and regional politics in our region. So over to you for your opening statement, and it's good to have you back.
Okay, thank you very much, Mirco, and good to be here with everyone from Bangkok here. I just have 4 points. Let me first address the issue of COVID-19 in the broader sense, and then I'll talk about the great power rivalry in Southeast Asia and ASEAN. 30 years ago, when we were studying EU, the evolution of the EU and ASEAN, there were a lot of comparisons. And so EU, I remember being kind of a collective security, and EU was leading the way with NATO, WEU, OSCE, and so on. And ASEAN was set up endemically as a kind of a cooperative security platform anyway. So, the first thing I would say is that the multilateralism and cooperative security still alive, but unwell. So we've come a long way in 30 years, and you can see now, COVID-19 has merely intensified the trends that we saw before COVID. So the great power rivalry and competition has been exacerbated and has intensified. Dr. Mely has mentioned the vaccines. from the pandemic to the vaccine, there was opportunities. There were opportunities and great chance for these great powers to work in collaboration and coordination, to work together to combat, combat and address the pandemic. But we didn't see that. We saw competition. We saw countries going their own way. In fact, it's very much a self-help. Every nation, every state for itself during the pandemic. And also we're seeing now with the vaccine development, it seems that we're going to see very divided, fragmented access to the vaccines, and I think that bears the trends that we saw before COVID-19. So COVID-19 really has exacerbated, intensified the trends that we saw before, the geopolitical rivalry and competition. Moving on to the cooperative security and multilateralism. ASEAN, Southeast Asia has been known as the anchor for cooperative security, multilateralism in Asia, the so-called the ASEAN centrality. And if you go through the timeline, the acronyms from the APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, the ASEAN Free Trade Area, right down to the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Plus 3, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meetings Plus, and so on. Along the way, there was an ASEAN Charter with the 3 communities. So ASEAN has come up with all these schemes and acronyms to forge and foster regional cooperation around ASEAN. So that's as multilateral as it gets around here in Asia, and that's considerable in the absence of alternatives. Now, this momentum has met with some challenges over the past decade, I would say, because ASEAN now has been overwhelmed by the great power competition and rivalry, especially I think China. And being Southeast Asia is being in the backyard of China, and that means there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of requirements for living next to such a giant. And I see here that there have been some ongoing trends. ASEAN has been divided by China, and I think you can see that mainland Southeast Asia, the countries, CLMTV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, they are having divergent preferences and interests compared to the maritime countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei, Singapore. So you can kind of see China is has exercised a veto on certain ASEAN agreements in the recent past. And this is an ongoing trend. Recently, we have the Trump administration is stepping up its game. It's upping its game, especially in mainland Southeast Asia, around the Mekong regions, but overall along the ASEAN lines. So the U.S. is kind of stepping up and pressing this Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, and China has this geostrategic Belt and Road Initiative, and we heard about India. So if you look around the region, it's really insecurities everywhere. I mean, you have problems with in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, the Mekong region, and I would say that now the Mekong region in mainland Southeast Asia, where China has built this upstream dams, at the expense of the interests of lower stream, downstream countries, this now has become a new issue on the ASEAN agenda. And Vietnam, as chair of ASEAN, has succeeded, I think, in making the Mekong an ASEAN issue. The South China Sea has always been an ASEAN issue, but now the Mekong is as well. So if you look at the landscape, the great power and rivalry preceded COVID-19, has been intensified by COVID-19, and now it's going to outlast COVID-19. And from pandemic, vaccine development, but we're seeing even more, moving into the military sphere. It really alarms me when the Global Times editor is talking about open warfare, how China has to defend itself vis-a-vis the United States. And the U.S. is pressing its alliance relationships, of course, treaty allies in Thailand, Philippines, but these countries, if you can gauge, Secretary Pompeo has been pressing hard for ASEAN to stand up to China. But the ASEAN governments have resisted, and in the latest, even the latest ASEAN statement from the 23rd Foreign Ministers meeting, there was an overt effort not to take sides, to take both sides, to do more with China, but to also do more with the US. And I think that's the dilemma for ASEAN. Different countries, when you get down to it, have different preferences. I think Cambodia, much more bandwagoning, we can see. Laos now is a kind of a debtor state to China. So both are deeply beholden to Beijing. Thailand is kind of going both ways. When the US comes, very receptive. When China comes, also very embracing. Myanmar, cannot do without China with this ethnic conflict. So I think the Vietnam and the Philippines, I would say Vietnam and the Philippines are two countries that have a lot of issues with China, South China Sea, but you can almost kind of set them in a different category now. You have ASEAN, I talked about maybe mainland interests, CLMT, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and you have the maritime. But Philippines and Vietnam, the two countries with contentious issues with China, maybe we might be able to put them in a different category, perhaps. So you can see China also has been promoting or coddling more authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia. Philippines, interesting that I noticed, the Philippines intelligentsia, the bureaucratic apparatus, even the popular sentiments, they seem much more wary of China. But the government of President Duterte very much pro-China. So you see that dichotomy, tension in the Philippines, but it could change if they have a new president. Vietnam, very much in a dilemma, in a bind, because you can see on the one hand they have very deep ties, economic ties with China, cannot do without China, and on the other hand, security relations have a lot of tension, friction. So this is a kind of a trend around the region. What to do with China, how to deal, manage, handle, and mitigate the challenges coming from China. And the U.S., I'm not sure if it's making things worse or trying to improve things. The U.S. is certainly under President Trump upping his game, as I mentioned, but I think a lot of countries in the region find the U.S. Unreliable. We saw from Obama, pivot, rebalance. That was a little bit disappointing because it was not followed through. And then Trump came in with a very aggressive, almost belligerent posture. And it is being followed through with more patrols, naval patrols, foreign ops, and even a bit more muscle flexing, a little bit more funding as well, like the Mekong region, for example. The U.S. has announced recently a Mekong-U.S. partnership. But we don't know if Mr. Trump, if President Trump loses the election, whether we will get something entirely different. I suspect we'll get a little bit more of the Obama posture. But the U.S.-China relationship, I think, is going to be on the rocks for the long term. So for us in Southeast Asia, what this means is that to navigate out of this great power, straitjacket, the bilateral trade straitjacket between China and the U.S., we have to do something different. First of all, I think Southeast Asia and ASEAN, there are two entities here, an organization and a region, have to come to terms. And, they have to come to terms so that they're not divided and kind of conquered, manipulated by Beijing. And I've been an advocate of finding a third way. And, we can see a little bit of, for example, the CPTPP, we're seeing a little bit of RCEP. But in that, we're looking for regional cooperation, multilateralism, cooperative security, ex-China and US. So if we can put aside somehow insulate from this US-China rivalry and competition, that will worsen over time. Then maybe we can kind of promote and forge a different kind of cooperative security platform through multilateral cooperation with India, Japan, South Korea, even Australia up to a point, and certainly ASEAN as the core. So if we can do that, maybe that is a way of navigating through this worsening, alarming great power rivalry and competition between the US and China. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thitinan, for your spot-on take. Indeed, a very complex environment in terms of balancing and bandwagoning for countries in Southeast Asia. and a complex environment to maneuver and to navigate in. And as you said, a strong case actually for Southeast Asian countries to rely even more on one another as they face the many uncertainties that lie ahead. Now, we already got a few questions in our chat, but I will, for the meantime, and I would ask other participants to join the discussion, use the moderator's privilege before we turn to the audience for our Q&A, and try to have a quick second round focusing very specifically on regional security cooperation and cooperative security. Raja has presented a somewhat pessimistic outlook when it comes to the cooperative security agenda for Asia. Mely seemed to be a little more optimistic in that regard, and then Thitinan gave us, I think, a very detailed overview as to what the different countries are up to in terms of their interests and agendas in Southeast Asia. So coming to the question that our colleague Bernd Berger has asked in the chat, in view of the lacking security status across Asia and rising nationalism across the region, what does it take to get the cooperative agenda when it comes to security back on track? Maybe, Raja, you can get us started with South Asia. I mean, we obviously have a regional organization called SAARC in South Asia that may or may not be very functional, but are you sort of completely disillusioned with the prospects for regional security cooperation in South Asia? And is it all wishful thinking, or do you see a silver lining at the end of the day?
No, SAARC is not the only route for regional cooperation. I think we should keep that in mind. I think as an Indian, I'm willing to acknowledge Pakistan has a special position. They're not willing to let economic cooperation move in SAARC without their political differences with India being resolved. So I'm not criticizing it, I'm noting it. So I think that's a fact. So what we've seen happen in the last few years is really emergence of other regional institutions, an attempt to revive the so-called BIMSTEC forum, that is 5 countries in South Asia, 2 countries in Southeast Asia, that is Thailand and Burma. So which is like a Bay of Bengal littoral. There is an attempt at reviving the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is look at a larger framework, and also look at Eastern subcontinent, that is a sub-regional framework for cooperation. So I think the trick is really find ways to cooperate rather than get fixated on the organizational framework. Here I would say certainly India has the biggest role as the largest country in the region. If India opens its markets for its smaller neighbors, you would definitely have more economic integration. If India takes the lead in putting together, for example, many of the things that ASEAN does, when the COVID pandemic started, India did convene a SAARC ministerial meeting. But I think the ways in which disaster management, COVID-19 pandemic management can be done in sub-regional, supra-regional forms, which is what I think India will have to keep trying. And I think ASEAN is always there to give us the example. And while India participates in the Asian institutions as well. So I'm not completely pessimistic. I'm saying that the structural change in the international system is going to create more complications for cooperative security. And I think Europe is a better example than what we're seeing in Europe, where the expected triumph of EU and NATO is now in serious problems. And Asia, of course, has always had a longer way to go. But I think they will keep trying different ways in which some security can be developed through cooperation.
Thank you, Raja. Perhaps Mely, would you want to add to that? I mean, you obviously made a very convincing case already in terms of ASEAN being a useful vehicle for economic cooperation, but is the same also true for the security affairs, or is ASEAN somewhat limited when it comes to, genuine regional security cooperation?
Well, you see, ASEAN is very realistic of what it has as far as security cooperation is concerned. In one of our webinars with the SWP, they were saying, now that there's this heightened great power competition, and since there's really no hard security structure in Southeast Asia, is it possible to have something like a NATO-like structure? I mean, from the very beginning, the 10 member states of ASEAN were very realistic of what we can do. And as I said, the whole notion of security in ASEAN is quite comprehensive. That's why they have this, within the track to they were promoting this, what they call the cooperative and comprehensive security. Comprehensive in the sense that security cooperation is not just limited to, the hardcore security cooperation, but in the context of developing countries, security comes at different levels. I mean, functional security cooperation is what ASEAN does best, right? And as far as trying to mitigate major power competition, what it does is to provide forums. That's why you have ASEAN-led institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia, which is foreign ministers, the ASEAN defense ministers, the EAS. And if you look and analyze each of these mechanisms, do they deal with, the kind of hardcore security issues? Well, at the most, when you talk about the EAS, now non-proliferation is in the agenda, but this is not really something that they look at very seriously, right? Because it is realistic with what it can actually do, but it doesn't matter that it doesn't really mean that they don't engage with this. I mean, there's an interest in Southeast Asia to ensure that the inter-Korean crisis is actually addressed. And this is where, at one point in 2017, ASEAN actually was approached by North Korea to see if they could actually do something about it, right? But some member states were reticent when it comes to dealing with, areas of piracy at sea, with maritime security. You do have mechanisms like the RECAP, the Regional Cooperation on Piracy at Sea, which is being led by Japan, but also led by Southeast Asia. So I think the point to remember when you're looking at the whole scenario of the different security issues in the region is that there are certain things which regional organizations can do, and they're quite clear about what they don't want to do. And what they don't want to do is to have something like a NATO-like structure. Now, recall that when the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting was conceived in 2005, it took a long time from the time ASEAN was established in 1967 to 2005, where they really talked about, military cooperation. Why? Because they were quite conscious that it will send the wrong signals to their big neighbor, which is China. But it doesn't mean, having said all that ASEAN should not actually call out, China for its incursions and adventurism in the South China Sea. And in fact, the ASEAN chair, Vietnam, and some other countries like the Philippines, are adamant that this kind of behavior should actually be reflected in the ASEAN statements that every time there is a meeting. So again, as Thitinan has mentioned, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, at certain points, you could see that it was divided. But now, in light of what has happened, right, you now have an existential threat more serious than a nuclear, the threat of nuclear weapons. You do really have, this pandemic that is upending all our lives. And this really therefore underscores the need for security cooperation at a particular level, right? So, it's a hard balancing act. But the long and short of it is regional organizations like ASEAN, given the kind of resources they have and what they stand for, the size, right? These are small and medium-sized power, are very realistic of the extent to which you can actually push security cooperation in the wider Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, as you would call it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mely. I think that's a very clear and on-point answer in regard to the question when it comes to cooperative security and how to get that agenda back on track. For you, Thitinan, there were several questions and remarks before regarding China's neighbors to the east and China's neighbors to the west. And one participant in our chat is wondering, with China's rising military and economic confidence and also political confidence, is it rather a case of enlarging cooperation politically and on behalf of global security, or keeping the status quo and thus avoiding confrontation? What is the preferred strategy from your point of view? And I think the colleague is particularly referring to the case of Taiwan. Maybe you could tackle that question. Okay,
thank you. Look, I think this ties in with the, I would like to tie this in with the earlier questions. First, this is an area where COVID-19 has been consequential, Mirco. COVID-19 has been costly to the ASEAN ways of doing things. So normally ASEAN is known for holding meetings, right? Doing meetings like this, as we're doing, online, virtual, it takes away the ASEAN strength sideline meetings, of having dialogues over coffee and golf course and so on, and meals and so on. So I think this has been kind of it has robbed ASEAN of what it's good at. So COVID to this extent, I think, has been kind of costly for ASEAN. I can see it throughout this year. I think also Vietnam has really geared up to do a great job as chair. It's done a good job, but I think it wanted to do more. So second, I would say, just following up on Mely's comment, ASEAN to me it's always been kind of a buffer and a bridge and a broker, right? A buffer between the great powers, in this case, US and China. And then the bridge, of course, try to link them and provide dialogue forums like the East Asia Summit, but also a broker with all these meetings and forums and platforms to perhaps come to agreement on certain areas. But this is a functional kind of a mandate or a functional way of doing things for ASEAN. As Mely says, it's soft, it's not hard. And it requires, it assumes and it requires the great powers to see it in their own interests, not to divide ASEAN or not to undermine the ASEAN role and centrality, because either one can do it. If they do it, it's actually detrimental to them, but they have to kind of see that benefit. And then I finally say that, this is a role where, since Germany now has an Indo-Pacific outlook, maybe this is an area where the EU can reinforce this kind of role for ASEAN as a buffer and bridge and broker, because the US and China seem to be dividing the region, seem to be forcing ASEAN countries, states to choose sides. Coming to the question now about the China's, paramount role in the region now through military, economic, political. You can see COVID-19 also. Clearly, we all depend so much on China. Tourism is very quiet in the ASEAN countries, because China is the number one source for tourists, for export, and as an economic partner in general. So China is all over. So I think that the status quo as we know it from before COVID, and I think that is now untenable, because China is not satisfied with the status quo. I don't call this a revisionism, because when you say revisionism, you're talking from an incumbent, established position. So I think that's a bit manipulative. But if the status quo is not tenable, it's not lasting, it cannot be sustained, we're looking for a new and a truly new normal, where China is in there and where we are here, and that we have not found yet. And that goes back to my earlier point about trying to find a third way, another way of providing cooperative security mechanisms without being overwhelmed and dominated by either the US or China.
Thank you, Thitinan. Our chat is slowly picking up speed and gaining momentum. So I would take the next two questions. Actually, suggest that we direct them at all three panelists, and you might want to jump in one by one. The first question from Sergio Grassi is about the Indo-Pacific. Against the background that Germany and Europe announced recently to get more engaged in the Indo-Pacific, what contribution could Europe and Germany make to freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific? So freedom of navigation and Europe's and Germany's particular contribution are the first question. And the second one is actually a pretty obvious, I would guess, with regard to the developments and events happening in early November. How do you think the outcome of the US or the upcoming US elections are going to affect cooperative security and regional cooperation in Asia? That is, whether a Trump administration stays in office or a Biden administration gets into office. Does that actually make a difference for regional cooperation in Asia and our regional affairs? So maybe we take it one at a time. Raja, maybe you want to get us started on freedom of navigation and in the US elections, and then we ask Mely and Thitinan to contribute as well.
So I think the way Germany can contribute is really, Germany doesn't have too many ships, so one is not expecting German ships to sail the waters of the Indo-Pacific or come to East Asia, South China Sea. But Germany as a major champion of international norms. For example, the very act of emphasizing international law, supporting the law of the sea, providing capacity for a lot of small countries and weaker nations in this region, including the island states, so the legal capacity to even make their own case. So I think there are multiple ways in which Germany can contribute, not merely in terms of deploying ships. Of course, Germany can do more with France. Together with Britain, they could do interesting things in terms of coordination, deploying German personnel on French or British ships. Those are always possible. But I think Germany brings a special credibility as a if you will, I mean, a power of norms. I mean, as a champion of norms, that I think has a huge role in shaping the debate. I mean, I think when the US and China present it, it becomes like a power contest. But I think we need Europe's voice. Europe as an empire of norms, it's often been said. Someone who says, look, there are genuine issues of law, norm, and principle, and that putting some discourse, changing the discourse of putting pressure on China to respect the accepted norms, that I think is important. On the second question, I mean, the US elections, it's really, my sense is if Trump comes back or if Biden wins, there will be an attempt at finding a modus vivendi with China, which I think rightly so. I mean, it's not that you can just take this confrontation forever. All countries, whether China's neighbors or the US or Germany, everybody has a stake in continued engagement with China on a reasonable terms of engagement with China. So I would say even Trump comes back, he would want to see whether a trade deal is still possible. And while Biden wins the election, they're already talking about putting climate change at the top of the agenda of reforming multilateralism and those kind of issues where they would start a dialogue. But my sense is the distance between the two has significantly increased, and is likely the next few weeks will make it worse. That's one part. Second, I think you can say the deep state in the US has really, on the security side, things have moved quite some distance, and I think that part is going to be hard to reverse. And when the US talks about decoupling, it's also important to remember China is the one which actually started the decoupling in a way, wanting to do things its own way, or strengthening China, making China less dependent on the West. So I think, and politically, it's also going to be hard for Xi Jinping to be seen as compromising. So the difficulties are quite big, but I think there will be considerable pressure on both to find ways to at least to limit this conflict in the near term. But it's anybody's guess where they will succeed.
Thank you, Raja. Mely?
Yeah, I think I don't really have much to say about the role of Germany, but only to echo what Raja has said about what it does best. And Germany has set an example, for many things. One is that as a big as a big power in Europe, it has also shown that it is responsible, that it doesn't show, it doesn't, that the power is actually used in a good way. The way Germany has dealt with the crisis, what it has done. So when you talk about the example that it has set, and Raja talks about norms, this is really, and I agree, this is something that Germany should really display. And in the context of the Indo-Pacific, Germany may not be it's not one of the dialogue partners of ASEAN, but it is a very important development partner. And Germany is part of Europe when Europe joins the ASEAN mechanism called ASEAN Regional Forum. So there are plenty of avenues for Germany to actually, either through the EU or through itself, to actually ensure that that what it does, right, has a demonstrative effect, or has a positive influence on the way multilateralism is actually now advancing in the region and the challenges that it meets. On the outcome of the 2020 election in the US, I think what's important in the context, if Trump wins, then I think we see more of the same, which is actually very worrying for multilateralism, because we can see his attitude, he doesn't believe in it, and he has withdrawn from the major multilateral agreements that is so consequential to the world. For example, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and the economic one, the trade agreement, the Comprehensive Trade Agreement, and even the Iran nuclear arms agreement. So hopefully, if Trump is there, then you can expect a more green prospect for multilateralism. But if Biden wins, then you will see hopefully a reversion of what Trump has done. And this, I think, if Biden wins, and as far as multilateralism is concerned, if the U.S. goes back to the Paris Agreement, that is actually an important avenue for it to also re-engage with China, because China wants to be a responsible stakeholder. So it's that's how, in a way, Biden finds multiple ways to re-engage China, by being involved in these multilateral agreements that the Trump administration has actually withdrawn from. Biden, of course, I think like any other American, whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, I think it also realizes the value of being tough on China when it comes to it's breaking international norms. So I think Biden will be consistent in that regard, but his approach will definitely be very different from Trump. The transactional approach of Trump is something that I think needs to really change. But in the context of the region is also very important, because Obama had the pivot to Asia, and maybe that's something that Biden can rethink. Is it a pivot 1.5 or Asia pivot 2, whatever you call it? But that is important because the U.S. needs to be engaged, and in the context of ASEAN. I mean, sure, we would like really to have a more, the Europeans would say, or the Germans would say, strategic autonomy in dealing with the kind of challenges that we have. But, the U.S. is a resident power of Asia, and China is a power in ASEAN's doorstep. So it's very difficult for ASEAN to have a more, that kind of strategic autonomy that we all desire to be. But I take the point of being seen to be actually an honest broker and not seen to be siding each other. And I think somebody like Biden will re-engage. If he comes to power, and his administration will re-engage with Asia. It actually goes a long way in improving some of the things that the Indo-Pacific outlook, particularly from the way ASEAN has conceptualized it, when going back to multilateralism, re-engagement, more inclusive, right? Because after all, cooperative security talks about inclusiveness, bringing together like-minded states and non-like-minded states. So going back to the basics of multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mely. Thitinan, what's your take on Germany's and Europe's potential contribution on the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific, and then the potential outcomes of the US elections and implications for Asia? You're mute, Thitinan. Can you unmute your mic?
To me, Germany has Germany is an exception among the major countries because it has a more high ground in its foreign policy and geostrategic projection. So, to engage, I can see now that Germany has bitten the bullet. In Berlin, they probably think that, Asia is the happening place. That's the only game in the globe. And so they have to bite the bullet and have an Indo-Pacific view. So now that view, to engage, I would not think about sending a ship to join this, naval patrols, this so-called FONOPs. It would come across as disingenuous and insincere and opportunistic, a bit of a bandwagoning, and it also would fall into the U.S. kind of posture. This is U.S.-led freedom of navigation, operational patrols, right? So that's not something for Germany. I think, as Raja said, and also Mely, that the moral high ground for Germany is rules-based. is leading from a rules base. What's left of the rules base? International order, liberal international order. What's right? What's wrong? There's still that sense. I think from Germany that you can have morality and foreign policy at the same time, and that's where Germany should be engaging. That's where its strength is. So UNCLOS, law of the sea. We've had decisions here. If Germany engages more in the Indo-Pacific with like-minded, I think maybe Japan, India a little bit more. So this could really shake up the Indo-Pacific framework. If Germany and presumably the EU along with it engages more deeply in the Indo-Pacific, I think that could be a good counterbalance, and it would lead to maybe a more wholesome Indo-Pacific canvas for the regional countries in Southeast Asia and beyond. The other question about the Trump and Biden, regardless of who wins, first we can make some continuities that we should not overlook. First, the U.S., the protracted polarization in the United States is going to continue. So if Biden wins, the Trump people are not going to be happy. If Trump wins again, the Biden people in the Democratic Party will not be happy. And then, they've been going at it. It's almost like an internal conflict now. And I think that's long-term. Second, even if Biden wins, the U.S.-China relationship will be difficult. I mean, I think you'll see less rhetoric, less tweeting, less drama, but the trajectory of the relationship is frictional. It's got tension because basically they're in competition. So, for Biden, I think it's a matter of degree. And if you look at the people around him, the holdovers from the Obama administration, Biden himself was the Obama vice president. We'll see, I think, some of the foreign policy projection from the Obama time, maybe, redress or remade, recast into a different language, different nuances and tactics and mechanisms. But then it would be a reversal of what Trump did. So this would then be the third continuity, that we would feel that the U.S. is not reliable. If you get a president like Obama, pivot, rebalance, didn't deliver. Trump is very belligerent and is a bit unpredictable. However, he has followed up. And, for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, the U.S. has been a counterbalance vis-a-vis China. I think Trump has caused a lot of headaches for Beijing. But then if Biden comes in and be more like Obama, then we would think that, what should we take, what should we view, how should we view the U.S. and, this unpredictability, unreliability. And therefore, I think we have to, nonetheless, regardless of who wins, always looking for an alternative, not U.S., not China. Between Biden and Trump, I think less headache with Biden, but maybe Trump has proved more. He has followed through more. At home, not popular, but abroad in Southeast Asia, not so bad. Certainly more than Obama could deliver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thitinan. Christian Roth is wondering, after the UAE and Bahrain recognized Israel, he's wondering whether there are any potential or maybe perhaps even surprising new partnerships that you can think of in the Asia Pacific, anything out of the box that we might not even be expecting. Any thoughts on that from our panelists?
There is some speculation that actually part of the October surprise could be a actual physical kinetic war between US and Iran, that the sanctions come to end in September next week. In fact, as early as then, there is a speculation at this point. So there is always, I think if you see the shift in US policy to the region, from under Obama, it was about cutting a deal with Iran. Now, last 4 years, it's been about isolating Iran. That actually has opened the door for getting the Gulf countries on the side of Israel. So we are, I think, potentially an explosive moment where the US might seek to push its advantage to the maximum. And within Asia, I think, I'll say, maybe Thitinan and Mely can speak about other countries in Southeast Asia. But within South Asia, Pakistan has always had a debate. Look, shouldn't we have normal relationship with Israel? After all, why is India allowed to have a free run with Israel? Pakistan will also benefit from having a relationship with Israel. Under General Musharraf, actually, in 2004-05, there was a big debate, and they almost came close, I believe, to actually recognizing. But in the end, the domestic politics prevented them from actually going ahead with a deal with Israel. And I don't know the debate in Indonesia or other places in Southeast Asia. Israel is always keen to have Muslim countries recognize it and deal with them. They will hugely value any additional countries that are willing to do business with them. So there might be most of the expected follow-throughs like Morocco, Sudan, and countries, Oman. But in Asia, if someone else does it, that could have a huge, huge impact on the way Asia perceives the Middle East.
Very interesting indeed, Raja. Now that you have already mentioned Iran, our viewer Hans-Joachim Schmidt is wondering if Biden will come back to the Iran deal. Does that have any implications for the nuclear issue with North Korea? Is the handling of nuclear in North Korea any different than what we currently see with the current administration?
If I might speak again, I mean, I think you saw the other day, Trump actually has said he's open for negotiations with Iran. So I think if you see Trump, I think for all the demonization of Trump that takes place, he was very eager to do a deal with North Korea. It's really the arms control establishment. It's really the nuclear non-proliferation establishment, which is unwilling to take out-of-the-box solutions. So while Trump is saying, look, politics must prevail in dealing with North Korea or Iran, while the traditional arms control non-proliferation fellows said, no, first we must fix the nuclear problem, only then we can have political normalization. So I think you should give Trump some credit, but I think at this stage, the pressure, I think at this point, I think there's more of a military conflict likely. But if he comes back, I think he would be quite open to offering a deal to both. And without John Bolton and others, perhaps, I don't know, this time he has a freer chance to do a political deal with North Korea.
Thank you, Raja. Since we are fastly approaching actually the end of our session, we have a question from Karl Lange, and in a way that's a very good transition into the concluding segment of our panel discussion. He is wondering, moving now from the geopolitical sphere to the cyberspace, how will the accelerating digitalization change the security architecture in our region? And perhaps that's a question that all three of you could tackle together with your concluding thoughts for our session. Shall I come again, Mely? Did you get the question?
So this how is what? I didn't get that.
How will the accelerating digitalization change the security architecture in our region? So we are moving from the geopolitical sphere a bit more into the cyberspace for our concluding round. Perhaps you would want to start, Mely?
Yeah.
Digitalization is I think, has its good side and its bad side. If you look at within the context of COVID-19, I mean, it clearly has, has actually helped, the fact that most of us were stranded and travel and has basically come to a halt. Digitalization has become very, very important. Now, even if I move away from cybersecurity for a while, just as an aside, this is an agenda that is really very important because it actually helps businesses that have suffered so much as a result of the halt to travel and tourism. And people a lot, I mean, this is why we are able to have this communication, because we have digital technology, right? It's a second best option, but the second best option actually helps, in saving some livelihood in the context of, in Singapore or in Southeast Asia, right? But at the same time, you are very conscious that the level of capacity is so uneven across the board, right? We have had this ASEAN connectivity digitalization program since 2010, but to some extent it has borne fruit, but it also then highlights the kind of inequality that's taken place. So if you move back to cybersecurity threats, well, it only makes it more acute because more and more people, you now really see some kind of asymmetrical conflict, and those who have the capacity to do so, to be able to counteract all these cyber threats are able to do so, but other countries that may not have the capacity, particularly when it comes to digital technology, not as sophisticated as the big countries, will actually suffer. Now, this is where multilateral security cooperation becomes very important, whether it's at the UN level, you have the GG, the expert group, and within the Asia Pacific, you have the different working groups that's looking at cybersecurity, best practices, for example, raising capacity. These are all very, very important in the light of, the kind of threats that we see at different levels. So when you look at digitalization, right? So you can see to what extent it has actually aided, in a way, filled some of the gaps that has become more acute in light of the crisis that we have. At the same time, it has exposed some of the vulnerabilities of both countries, as far as security is concerned, and for communities as far as their own security happens, right? And this is really where, this is now the challenge in light of this kind of a situation that we find ourselves in. And when we're really talking about preparing for the new normal, the importance of digitalization, in all facets of our lives, including security, guaranteeing our state security and individual security, it becomes even more important. Yeah.
Thank you, Mely. Thitinan, what's your thinking on how digitalization is always not changing in the region?
Yeah, I think that the wording was that the cyber acceleration. So I'll take it in two ways. So on the cyber security, I agree with Mely. So the digital divide is going to widen. And so the countries with the least access, the lowest technology, there will be at the detriment. They'll suffer. There will be the victims, and you can look around Southeast Asia. There's a lot of gaps there vis-a-vis the rest of the more developed, more advanced economies, countries. That's one concern on cybersecurity. I think we're very ill-equipped to handle the next stage and stages of cybersecurity requirements, where the security platform is moving to the virtual cyber world. The second direction I'll take is that, the cyber technology. I'm not sure if the question acceleration means technology or security, but it's also a technology side. Technology is very quickly, this is where we're being forced to choose. So do we use 5G Huawei or not? And so for Thailand, Huawei, we will use Huawei. But now the technology war between the US and China, we really feel it. And the US calls it this decoupling. I think the Chinese kind of call it a de-Americanization. But what will happen now is we're having an increasingly parallel universe of technologies, and we have to kind of use one or the other. I think in Southeast Asia, certainly I can see in Thailand, we're trying to use both. So we use Line, we use WeChat, Weibo, and Baidu, and that's usable. We have nothing against that. But if you look at the big techs, both countries have big techs. The US is more dominant. So this is a concern because we might be forced to choose, but we want to choose both. Thank you.
Thank you, Thitinan. Raja?
Yeah, I would say just three things to follow with Thitinan. One, I think the commercial sphere, which was seen as, just 10 years ago, we were thinking, look, the digital domain is going to be this wonderland of freedom, and everyone is going to be free of state control. There's going to be this happy live ever after kind of a feel. What we've seen is actually the technological sphere, the digital sphere, is very much vulnerable to geopolitics. And what we've seen, whether it is the TikTok, or whether it is the banning of digital apps, that the confrontation between US and China, and more broadly, it's going to draw in a lot of other countries. Many of US friends and partners have already pulled away from Huawei. And I think we're just at the beginning of that conflict. But it's going to be quite wrenching and painful for both US and China, because themselves have invested so much in each other. And meanwhile, other countries are going to have to make hard choices. So the commercial domain is going to be deeply securitized and politicized. The second is on the military side itself. The cyber will increasingly become a preferred weapon in the near term, and I think that we've seen it's happened last few years, and I think it's going to grow. There can be actually devise arms control rules. The group of governmental experts has tried. While there's agreement on general principles, I think we are a long way from any kind of agreement between the Russia, China on the one hand, and the Western powers on the other hand. This divide in terms of how to secure cyberspace, what are the rules that ought to govern the management of cyberspace. And it's not just left to the states. Microsoft has been at the forefront of promoting a code of conduct. So you have actually a fairly expansive debate that is just beginning in terms of how do we deal with the cyber challenge from individual customers who use computers to states and the critical infrastructure. Within this sphere, there is actually the impact of AI on traditional areas of deterrence, nuclear weapons, for example. Nuclear deterrence is increasingly linked to digital capabilities. So I think we're going to have a lot of change in the way US and China are going to look at deterrence, how Russia is going to look at it, what are the framing in terms of what is stability of deterrence. It was assumed certain characteristics, but now the digitalization is going to challenge. AI in particular is going to challenge a lot of those premises of stability for nuclear deterrence. And it's also going to affect the space side. And we're already talking about, robotic weapons, human control. So big issues are already coming in that frame. And finally, interestingly, I'm sure German's audience will be very interested, the question of values. That is what we're seeing happening in Xinjiang or various other places. That is the digital technology is going to be used as a tool of oppression. There are others who point to there's not much difference between surveillance capitalism and the surveillance state, where China has really set new standards. While surveillance is important, I think we've seen in the case of pandemic, surveillance has been critical to managing the spread of things. On the one hand, so there are positive sides to surveillance. But I think the question of what are the conditions, what are the constraints that we need to place, both on digital capitalism as well as digital surveillance state, is going to be a big debate. Here, I would say Europe has already played a big role in terms of coming up with norms and normative principles. Here, I would think what Europe did on GDPR gave it a special role. And today, Europe, I think, will again have to take a lead role, both in constraining, capital as well as this, state authoritarianism on people. So I think here, many in Asia would be happy to follow European lead on these issues.
Thank you so much, Raja, and thank you, Thitinan. Thank you, Mely. I'm afraid this already concludes our discussion for this session. It's actually been a real tour de force, right? We covered a lot of territory, which again just speaks to the complex environment and the manifold challenges in the Asia Pacific. What I'm taking away from our discussion is that conditions for cooperative security in Asia continue to be extraordinarily difficult, but at the same time, there might also be opportunities for exploring new formats of multilateral engagement in the strategic new normal that we all see unfold currently, be it with regard to minilateral formats, with regard to issue-based alliances. So lots of room for new formats, I guess. And what I'm particularly happy and what I find particularly noteworthy towards the end of our discussion is that you're all arguing in favor of a stronger role for Germany and the European Union to take in the Indo-Pacific. And very much so in the context of Germany's role as a normative power, as a power that is setting rules and the framework, and emphasizing a value. So I think that's a very powerful message towards the end of our discussion, also in light of the recent Indo-Pacific guidelines that the German Foreign Office has brought forward. So I thank you wholeheartedly, Raja, Mely, and Thitinan, as well as our audience, for a very lively debate in our chat. And I'm glad to say that our discussion actually continues. The conference is not over. We have our Middle East panel this afternoon, that is afternoon European time. And tomorrow we have the Africa and Latin America panels. So please tune in again for those sessions as well. Thank you again to the FES support team. Thank you in particular to our fantastic interpreters, and stay safe and stay healthy. Goodbye from Singapore.
Thank you, Mirco. Thank you.